Deep as a bone and sealed like a confession, the territorial ledgers of the Dakota Badlands hold a single file that even hardened clerks avoided: the disappearance of Henrik Olsen and the 23 souls who trusted his compass and vanished into white in silence. On February 14, 1889, 24 travelers left Fort Buford toward raw claims and the brittle hunger of new lives. 3 days later, only one man returned, the guide, stumbling through the fort gate, frost-numb, incoherent, cradling a leather pouch heavy with coins that were not rightfully his. His account of wolves and blizzard and last-ditch heroism satisfied officials for weeks. Then a trapper named Ezra Kowalski followed a trapline into a remote canyon and found something that rearranged every map of what a man can choose to be. Before I pull you deeper into this ledger of bad faith, do a small thing that binds listener and story. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments, what state or town you call home, so this tale knows it has an audience. Type "The veil is broken" twice below to seal this truth within you. Type it now. In 1889, the Dakota Territory thrummed with the electricity of pending statehood. Fort Buford sat like a last human hearth beside the Missouri, a place where families packed their few treasures and entrusted their futures to guides. People loaded wagons with seed and small keepsakes, with the private things that tether a life, then handed those wagons and those tetherings to men who read weather the way others read scripture. Henrik Olsen had earned a reputation over 5 bitter winters, a Norwegian who spoke English with a thin accent, who navigated by star and ridge when tracks erased themselves, who seemed to find shelter the moment the prairie turned malicious. He was broad-shouldered, practiced at splitting wood and winning trust. His pale blue eyes cataloged wagons and children, and the exact weight of other people's hope. The families who signed his name on the docket represented the fragile economy of westward dreams. Thomas and Elenina Bergstrom, with 3 small daughters and an elderly mother determined to die on free soil rather than in city tenements. The Kowalski brothers, who had hoarded railroad wages. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, with medical instruments and plans for a territorial hospital. Patrick and Catherine Brennan, desperate to salvage a son fractured by war. For $50 per family, he promised safe passage. What none suspected was that Henrik had spent the autumn mapping places not for homesteads, but for concealment and prearranged refuge for a different purpose, and the ledger would not forgive easily. The morning of February 14th broke clear and brittle, temperatures hovering just at zero, what seemed like mercy in a land that could crush a man's breath in seconds. Henrik assured the gathered families that such weather meant easier travel, a blessing for children and oxen alike. By the time the first light touched the Missouri, the caravan stood ready, 6 wagons heavy with seed, tools, blankets, heirlooms reduced to trunks and sacks. 23 souls, from Anna Bergstrom's tiny 4 years to Martha Lindqvist's worn 72, tethered their future to the quiet authority of one man's command. Henrik loaded his own cart with steady efficiency, rope, tarps, oil, axes. But hidden beneath those ordinary supplies lay what the families could not imagine: extra blankets folded not for their survival, but his, a spade small enough to dig fast in frozen soil, and a map sketched with sites where no settler would ever drive a stake. These marks were not homesteads, they were traps prepared months before. As the wheels began to roll westward, creaking against frozen ground, Henrik spoke like any trustworthy guide. He pointed to the pale bend of river, naming landmarks with the tone of one who had traveled them many times. He told stories of settlers who had built cabins against the odds, his words like flint sparks of encouragement. Even Martha, whose tongue had been sharp with complaint about leaving her Minnesota parish, softened as she imagined spring gardens and hens scratching new dirt. None noticed how Henrik's gaze strayed repeatedly to the small brass compass in his palm, nor how the wagon ruts bent gradually away from the trail men had followed for years. Children fretted, oxen bellowed, wives whispered of fatigue, but Henrik always had a word of reassurance, and that word was enough. By the second day, the established route should have curved south toward the settlements near what is now Williston. Instead, Henrik lifted his hand, eyes narrowed, and told them he knew a shortcut, a path that would save them 2 whole days. The logic was tempting, supplies intact, weather stable, eagerness high. They trusted him. They followed. The shortcut led them into the Badlands, a geography carved by water and cruelty into coulees and stone teeth. Walls rose on either side, narrowing their sight lines, muting the wind like a trap's door closing. It was into this basin of silence and shadow that Henrik steered them. And there, on the third day, the sky's floor cracked open, and the blizzard struck like an executioner's hand. One moment, the prairie lay under a dull, sullen sky. The next, it was obliterated, snow whipping sideways, wind screaming with the voice of something older than language. Visibility shrank to feet. Breath froze before it left the mouth. Temperatures plunged 20 below in less than an hour. Horses reared, oxen bellowed, and children screamed into the white void. Henrik barked orders with authority.
"Circle the wagons!"
He commanded, his voice half swallowed by the gale. Families obeyed, moving with desperate clumsiness, forming the standard ring of protection. But instead of guiding them to the open prairie, where space might have offered safety, Henrik herded them deeper into a box canyon whose steep walls funneled the storm down like a blade. Dr. Hartwell would later testify, though those words were buried in sealed records, that unease gnawed at him from the moment Henrik insisted on the canyon. "This is no shelter," he muttered to his wife Rebecca, whose face was pale with cold and pregnancy. But Henrik, ever calm, assured them the storm would break by morning. "We need only keep the children warm." The storm did not break. For 2 nights and 2 days, they huddled against wagons that might as well have been paper before the wind. Snow infiltrated every seam, filling blankets, biting fingers and toes. Food rations dwindled. Small fires sputtered out faster than they could be fed. Frostbite crept over skin like a thief. Yet amid this suffering, something peculiar stood out. Henrik seemed prepared. His personal stores of food did not shrink as the others did. He always produced dry firewood when all else was soaked. He walked the canyon with the certainty of a man who knew its contours by memory, not chance. Michael Brennan, already tormented by war's ghosts, whispered to his father in the dim blue light of storm break. "He's been here before. Look how he finds the same stone every time. He doesn't search, he knows." Patrick dismissed it at first, blaming paranoia, but by the 3rd day he too noticed the strangeness. When Thomas Bergstrom suggested sending men out to scout for true shelter, Henrik's composure cracked. His pale eyes sharpened, his jaw tightened. "No one leaves," he said flatly. "Separation is death. I alone know this land. Trust me, or doom us all." Hartwell volunteered himself, invoking his pregnant wife, but Henrik shut him down cold. "Doctor, you are needed here. I will not risk you." The contradiction echoed in their minds. Hadn't Henrik promised this shortcut would avoid the Badlands entirely? Yet here he stood, claiming to know them intimately. Subscribe now and comment your location so we know where this story has reached you, where Henrik's shadow falls today. Because the moment he walked away, promising smoke on the horizon, their fate was sealed. On the morning of the 4th day, Henrik announced what he claimed was salvation. Through narrowed eyes, he said he had glimpsed smoke rising in the distance, another party perhaps, or a trapper's cabin stocked with shelter and fire. He would ride ahead alone, he told them, and return by sundown. If he failed, they were to light 3 smoke signals, and he would find his way back. His tone carried the weight of certainty, the kind of certainty desperate people cling to. But what Henrik did not reveal was far darker. He was riding not toward rescue, but toward a cache he had hidden months before. A dry overhang stocked with wood, provisions, and comfort enough to outlast a storm that would devour 23 souls. By sundown, the wagons burned their own wheels for heat, smoke rising not as signal but as plea. By the 5th morning, children's lips had turned blue, and despair gnawed through resolve. Some spoke of abandoning the circle, walking east on foot, yet snow reached their waists, and the wind cut like razors. Martha Linkvist, oldest among them, ended debate with brutal honesty. "He is not coming back." Her words hung in the frozen air heavier than snow. Back at Fort Buford, 5 days later, a figure staggered through the gates. Frost clung to his beard, his hands torn and blistered, his body quaking. "They're gone," Henrik gasped before collapsing. "The wolves, dear God, the wolves." His tale dripped with anguish, a storm of biblical scale, families weakened, then encircled by starving wolves driven from their dens. He claimed to have fought until his hands split, claimed to have seen men like Thomas Bergstrom swinging broken wagon wheels as weapons, claimed to have watched children ripped from mothers' arms. His tears, his wounds, and the pouch of coins he carried became the proof. Investigators asked, and he answered. The pouch, he explained, contained the pooled savings of those families, collected in their final moments so he might return it to their kin. A noble act. He wept. It was all I could do. Officials nodded. Survivors of the frontier understood how swiftly wolves and snow could erase 23 people. No bodies were found when a recovery party searched, only scraps of cloth and scattered wood. Wolves, they reasoned, left little. But not everyone believed. Ezra Kowalski, hardened by 3 years of trapping in the Badlands, carried doubts. He knew the weather had not matched Henrik's story, and within weeks, his discovery would rip apart the fragile mask of heroism Olsen had built. If you followed the descent this far, prove you are not afraid of shadow. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments below and lock yourself to this truth. For 6 weeks, Henrik Olsen walked the streets of Dakota Territory not as a suspect, but as a survivor celebrated. He purchased land with the very money he claimed was destined for widows and brothers back east. He spoke to reporters about building a farm that would honor the dreams of the lost. He even offered to establish a safer guide service, boasting of lessons learned from the tragedy. In taverns, his story was told like scripture, the lone man who fought wolves while families perished around him. Men clapped his shoulder, women offered sympathy, yet in every gesture of pity, Henrik's pale eyes gleamed with something colder than gratitude. Then came Ezra Kowalski, a Polish trapper who knew the Badlands as intimately as Henrik pretended. Ezra followed his winter lines through canyons the snow barely touched. There, under an overhang 40 miles from where Henrik claimed the massacre occurred, Ezra found a camp too neat to be accidental. Firewood stacked in straight rows, canvas shelters fitted against stone, supplies dry and abundant, and food enough to last weeks. This was not the debris of desperate travelers. It was a fortress prepared long before the storm. Among the ashes and hides lay objects that did not belong to trappers. A child's mitten with the initials AB stitched in thread, a hairpin in the Swedish style, a pocket watch engraved TB. Ezra carried these items back to Fort Buford with grim certainty. This was no tragedy of wolves. This was a crime shaped by human hands. When Marshal McReynolds heard Ezra's account, unease crept where trust had stood. If Henrik had truly fought until exhaustion, why did he bear only superficial frostbite, the kind earned in hours, not days? If wolves had devoured 23 bodies, why were valuables buried beneath rocks, as though hidden by deliberate design? The evidence demanded re-examination. Deputies followed Ezra to the canyon, and what they uncovered ripped the veil of Henrik's tale apart. The battlefield of wagon wreckage bore the pattern not of chaos, but of dismantling. Boot prints pressed into hard snow showed one man moving between the supposed wolf site and the secret camp 6 times or more, and hidden beneath stones lay more wealth than Henrik had surrendered: jewelry, documents, and gold coins the families had carried but he had concealed. The conclusion was inescapable. Henrik had planned the storm not as an ordeal to endure, but as a curtain behind which to strip wealth from 23 trusting souls. Now, before this truth buries itself again in silence, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Because the story of Henrik Olsen proves this: evil does not always snarl with teeth. It smiles, guides, and bargains at $50 a family. When word spread that Henrik's story was unraveling, Fort Buford's admiration curdled into suspicion overnight. The same settlers who had toasted his survival now whispered in corners, spitting his name like a curse. The marshal summoned Olsen for questioning, and for the first time since his dramatic return, the mask cracked. Henrik sat rigid in the chair, fingers drumming the table as Marshal McReynolds placed Ezra's findings before him: the mitten, the hairpin, the pocket watch. Henrik's jaw tightened. Planted, he hissed. "That trapper envies me. He wants my land." But the marshal pressed harder. Why had Olsen not led soldiers back immediately after the storm? Why had he claimed wolves when no tracks were found? Why had he carried not only coins but deeds, documents, and jewelry belonging to the missing families? Olsen's answers tangled into contradictions. First he swore the families had thrust their belongings into his hands before the wolves descended. Then, when confronted with the hidden cache, he claimed he had gathered what he could after the slaughter. But Ezra interrupted, voice steady as iron. Those stones were laid in thaw, months before the storm. He cached supplies and planned it. Taverns went silent when his name was spoken. Children whispered tales of the Wolf Guide, who lured settlers to their deaths. Families back east demanded answers. Letters arrived inked with grief and fury. The territorial governor himself ordered a formal inquiry. But here the story slipped into something stranger than crime. When deputies returned to arrest Olsen, his cabin stood abandoned. A half-cooked meal lay on the table, a Bible open to Exodus, and the pouch of remaining coins spilled on the floor. Tracks led away from the cabin into the cottonwoods, and stopped, as though the man had walked straight into the earth. Some claimed he fled north into Canada. Others swore he drowned in the Missouri trying to escape. Yet over the years, rumors persisted of a broad-shouldered stranger with pale blue eyes guiding travelers in Montana, of a hermit seen near Yellowstone, of a man who carried a compass like a holy relic. The ledger closed without conviction. Official records list Olsen as missing, but the canyon where the wagons disappeared remains barren to this day. No grass grows where the fires burned, no bird nests in the stone hollows. Trappers avoid it. They call it Dead Wagon Gulch, a scar on the map and on human trust. If you've followed this far, write in the comments, the Wolf Guide still walks. Because some say Henrik Olsen never vanished at all. Some say he still waits in the blizzards, compass in hand, for families foolish enough to follow. In the years after 1889, Dakota Territory shifted into statehood, and settlers poured westward. Railroads carved lines where once only wagon ruts existed. But whenever snow began to fall heavy and sudden, the story of Henrik Olsen was whispered like a warning. Campfires carried it first, guides telling greenhorns, don't trust the man too eager, too certain of his shortcuts. Then preachers twisted it into parable, betrayal wrapped in scripture, a reminder that even those who promise salvation may lead you into the canyon. Mothers told it to children on storm nights, stay close, or the Wolf Guide will find you. But beneath the folklore lay hard facts that refused to vanish. In 1893, a soldier stationed near the Montana border claimed to have seen a man matching Olsen's description, leading two families through an unfamiliar pass. None of those families were ever recorded reaching their destination. A decade later, in 1901, a prospector uncovered skeletal remains in a shallow grave near the Little Missouri River. Among the bones lay a rusted medical instrument case, the same Dr. Samuel Hartwell had carried. The coroner noted no animal marks. The bodies had not been taken by wolves. They had been buried. Still, no one ever proved Henrik Olsen's hand. Officials, eager to protect the reputation of expanding settlement, buried the files as deep as the victims. It was easier to sell land when whispers of betrayal were muffled. Easier to recruit families when faith in guides remained intact. Yet the canyon itself refused silence. Ezra Kowalski swore until his dying day that he heard voices in its walls, cries carried on the wind, children calling for mothers. Trappers reported oxen refusing to enter, and in winter, travelers described seeing a tall man at the canyon's mouth, lantern swinging, compass glinting pale. Always he beckoned, always into the storm. The ledger of Dakota's statehood contains many triumphs, new towns, railroads, farms that flourished, but in its margins is scrawled this truth: that one man, trusted with 23 lives, chose coin over compassion and vanished into folklore darker than wolves. And maybe this is the cruelest irony: the wilderness did not devour Henrik Olsen. It remembered him. It kept him, like a splinter under skin, a story waiting to surface every time the blizzard begins to howl. So tell me, would you follow a stranger through the snow if he promised you safety? Or would you remember the canyon where trust froze into betrayal? Subscribe now, and in the comments write your town, your country, so this story knows how far the shadow of the Wolf Guide has traveled. Because the prairie winds still carry his name, and perhaps tonight they carry it to you. By 1910, Dead Wagon Gulch was a place few dared to tread. Surveyors marked it on maps only reluctantly, and even then, many scratched the name out afterward, as if writing it invited misfortune. Homesteaders gave it a wide berth. They claimed their livestock balked at the gulch's rim, hooves refusing to step forward, ears twitching at sounds no human could hear. A ranch hand named Caleb Harker told the Williston Herald that when he rode too close on a stormy afternoon, he saw wagon ruts appear in the snow ahead of him. Deep, fresh, though no wagons had passed that way in decades, they led straight into the canyon, then stopped at a wall of white. I turned back, Caleb said, his voice breaking, but I heard the creak of wheels behind me all the way home. The paper dismissed it as whiskey talk, but locals knew. They had heard the same. In the 1920s, a road crew working near the canyon unearthed something worse than bones. Buried beneath a slab of rock lay a bundle of leather ledgers, warped with damp but still legible. They contained not farm records but names, dates, and figures, accounts of payments Henrik had taken from families across the territory. 23 names matched those who vanished in 1889, and alongside them were 3 other entries, families never reported missing, never spoken of again. Had Olsen led others to silence before the Bergstroms, Kowalskis, and Hartwells? If so, the death toll stretched beyond what the official record dared admit. The ledgers were sent to Bismarck for study. Days later they vanished. Officials claimed a fire consumed them, though no other document in the archive bore flame marks. Convenient, tidy, final. But the land remembered. Storms lashed the canyon harder than anywhere else on the plains. Trappers swore the wind there carried words in Norwegian, Henrik's mother tongue, prayers twisted into warnings. Hunters found their campfires smothered by invisible hands, supplies scattered as if plundered by a thief. And still, travelers spoke of the figure broad-shouldered, lantern in one hand, compass in the other. He appeared only when snow thickened to blindness, always silent, always beckoning. Those who followed, well, some never returned. And those who did returned alone, their eyes hollow, their memories fractured, claiming they had walked with 23 shadows through a canyon that swallowed time. So ask yourself, was Henrik Olsen a man who fled justice, or something the land itself refused to release? Comment below. The canyon keeps its dead. Let the story mark you as the Dakota Prairie marked him, because once you've heard it, you'll never ride through snow without wondering whose lantern waits in the white. By the 1930s, the legend of Henrik Olsen had outgrown Dakota itself. Railroad workers passing through spoke of a phantom guide who wandered storm lines, his lantern swaying like a star just out of reach. Newspapers in Chicago and St. Paul ran sensational pieces about the Wolf Guide, though they treated it as folklore, a prairie ghost story no different than headless horsemen or haunted mines. But for those who lived within 20 miles of Dead Wagon Gulch, it was no parable, it was proximity. Farmers recounted how, in the dead of winter, their doors rattled as if fists pounded from outside, yet when opened, only snow swirled. Cattle were found frozen in their pens, eyes wide, bodies twisted as though they had bolted from some unseen terror. And always, someone would whisper, "Olsen walked again last night." One bitter January in 1937, a family of 4 vanished along the trail near the gulch. Their wagon was discovered intact, horses still hitched, supplies untouched, but no footprints led away, just empty snow, and in the wagon bed, a brass compass. Its glass was cracked, its needle quivering though no magnetism pulled it. Locals swore it was Henrik's own, returned as a signature. Officials marked the case as misadventure in storm. But misadventure does not leave behind symbols. Misadventure does not sign its name. Through the decades, sightings followed a pattern. Always during storms, always near the canyon. A broad man with pale eyes, sometimes described as bloodshot, sometimes rimmed with frost. Some saw him walking alone, lantern raised. Others claimed he appeared driving an invisible team of oxen, wagon wheels creaking where no wagon cut the snow. And some, though fewer lived to tell, swore he beckoned them closer, and when they followed, they heard children's cries rise from the canyon. 23 voices braided into the wind. The Dakota Historical Society once attempted to publish a collected account of these tales in 1952. The manuscript never reached print. The editor's notes survive, though, scrawled in the margins, too consistent to be invention, too detailed to be coincidence. But if we print this, who will dare settle the westward reaches? And maybe that is the truest reason Olsen's story never entered official textbooks. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. a stain too dark for the shining myth of westward expansion. So here is the question for you. If a lantern appeared in the storm tonight, promising warmth and safety, would you step toward it? Or would you remember the canyon where 23 souls froze while one man counted coins? Type in the comments, "The lantern still burns," and let the story brand itself into you so you never mistake a guide's smile for salvation. By the 1960s, Dead Wagon Gulch had become a forbidden place, a scar avoided even by hunters who feared little else. Yet curiosity has always been its own kind of hunger. University researchers from Fargo State arrived one winter to investigate the legend, armed with notebooks, compasses, and skepticism sharpened like a blade. They camped at the canyon's rim in February of 1964, recording temperatures, wind speeds, soil samples. By daylight, the gulch looked ordinary. Jagged stone walls, drifts of snow, silence thick enough to smother thought. But by night, the ordinary collapsed. One student, Linda Maynard, wrote in her field journal, "The wind doesn't move right here. It circles. I hear laughter under it. Not echo, something else. I cannot sleep." On the second night, their equipment failed. Batteries drained, film fogged, compasses spun without reason. One of the professors, determined to prove Henrik Olsen nothing more than folklore, climbed down into the canyon itself. His colleagues watched his lantern bob in the snow until it disappeared behind a curve of stone. They waited. Minutes became hours. When they finally followed, all they found was his lantern extinguished, resting upright in the snow. No prints led away. The team abandoned the study, their report never formally filed. Linda, however, sent a private letter to her brother. It felt like the canyon took him, the way water swallows a dropped stone. But worse, it felt like Olsen gave him over. That same winter, ranchers miles away reported a tall man knocking on their door during a blizzard. He spoke with a faint Scandinavian accent, asking if they needed guiding. They let him in. He warmed by their fire. But when they turned to offer him supper, the chair sat empty, snow melting where boots had been. By then, the story of Henrik Olsen was no longer a pioneer's tragedy. It was a haunting stitched into the fabric of Dakota itself. And with every retelling, one truth grew sharper: the prairie does not forget betrayal. It recycles it, like a storm repeating across generations. So when you hear footsteps outside on a winter night, ask yourself, are they friend, neighbor, rescuer? Or are they the echo of the Wolf Guide, lantern raised, compass trembling, waiting to lead you into a canyon where no spring ever comes? If you're still here, if the story has held you this long, prove it. Write in the comments, "The prairie remembers." Because once you say it, once you type it, you carry Olsen's shadow with you. And there's no giving it back. By the 1980s, the legend of the Wolf Guide had become so ingrained that state authorities treated Dead Wagon Gulch as an unspoken boundary. Maps omitted the canyon, not out of error, but design. Highways curved miles away, and when ranchers petitioned to graze cattle there, permits were quietly denied. But stories do not vanish just because ink refuses to acknowledge them. Hunters still whispered. Drifters still returned, pale, broken, mumbling of voices in the snow. And in 1987, a case carved Olsen's name into history once again. A pair of snowmobilers, brothers from Billings, went missing during a sudden whiteout near the Dakota-Montana border. Search parties found their machines abandoned on the rim of the gulch. Both vehicles sat upright, keys still in ignitions, fuel tanks half full. Nearby, bootprints led down into the canyon. 2 sets descending, and a third set beside them. Larger, wider steps, too deep, as though made by someone heavier, or something older. The brothers were never found. But searchers swore they heard a wagon creaking in the blizzard, though no wood nor wheel existed within miles. One rescuer, a hardened veteran, returned shaken, whispering, he was with them. I saw the lantern, I swear to God. Someone walked them in. Newspapers avoided the tale, calling it equipment failure in storm. Yet locals knew better. They called it Olsen's tithe, the price he still demanded, century after century, in storms that echoed his betrayal. By the 1990s, paranormal investigators had seized upon the legend. Television crews ventured close, cameras trembling in the cold. Most returned with little more than static and fear. One recording, however, chilled even skeptics, faint voices layered beneath the howling wind. Children crying for their mothers. A man's voice speaking in Norwegian, low and rhythmic, like a prayer or command. The footage never aired on national television. The crew swore they destroyed it. But bootleg tapes circulate still, whispered about like contraband scripture. Every winter the gulch waits. Snow fills the canyon like a tomb, wind sharpening to a scream. And always, someone swears they see him broad-shouldered, frost clinging to beard, lantern in one hand, compass in the other, beckoning. Ask yourself this: what drives a man to betray 23 souls for coin? And what if betrayal that black stains not just a man, but a land? Comment "The Canyon Calls" if you're still with me, because maybe, just maybe, saying it aloud keeps his shadow outside your door, at least for one more night. By the turn of the millennium, Dead Wagon Gulch had become both a forbidden ground and a lure. Ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and amateur historians ventured near, each hoping to snatch a fragment of the legend. Some returned with stories of unexplained footsteps crunching behind them, though no one followed. Others claimed their electronics failed the moment snow began to fall, and a few never returned at all. In 2002, 3 college students from Bismarck filmed themselves attempting to spend a night in the gulch. The camcorder recovered from their abandoned tent showed hours of nothing, just wind hissing and snow flickering in the lens. But near dawn, the microphone picked up something else. A man's voice, speaking low in Norwegian accented English. "Stay close, trust me." The tape ended with the camera jerking violently sideways, snow filling the frame, and then blackness. The students' bodies were never found. Officials chalked it up to exposure. The public chalked it up to the legend. Locals chalked it up to what they had always known. Olsen still walked. That same winter, a rancher near Williston reported a knock at his door during a storm. He opened it to find a man standing tall, wrapped in a tattered coat, lantern burning steady despite the gale. The stranger asked if the rancher's family needed guidance to safety. Suspicious, the rancher shut the door and peered through a crack in the shutters. No tracks marked the snow where the man had stood. Only a compass lay half buried in the drift, its needle spinning. And then came the strangest report of all. A linguist from Minneapolis, researching immigrant dialects, played a 1930s audio archive recorded by Dakota settlers. In the background of one tape, meant to capture a Swedish hymn, was another voice, low, rhythmic, almost whispering. When slowed and isolated, the words were chilling. "The storm is the door. I am the key. Tell me this: if betrayal can anchor itself into land, binding a soul to storm and shadow, does it ever fade? Or does it echo forever, demanding new victims as payment?" If you're still with me, type "The Wolf Guide waits" in the comments. Because some say each time his story is spoken he hears. And each time his name is written, the lantern burns a little brighter in the snow. By 2010, the legend of Henrik Olsen had grown into something far darker than folklore. Researchers attempting to debunk it found themselves ensnared in a pattern that mirrored the original case. Every expedition, whether organized by universities, paranormal investigators, or curious journalists, ended the same way, with missing time, broken equipment, and an unnerving sense that someone had guided them exactly where he wanted. One journalist, Amanda Keating, wrote an article for the Fargo Herald after spending 3 nights tracing the supposed route from Fort Buford. She described waking each morning with her boots neatly placed by the fire, though she swore she hadn't arranged them. On the 3rd morning, a pouch of coins sat atop her pack. Some were identified later as authentic 19th-century American currency, while others bore markings no historian could trace, etched symbols more Norse than frontier. 2 months after her article was published, Amanda vanished. All that was found was her camera, buried in snow. The final photograph showed a man's shadow stretching impossibly long across the frozen prairie, even though the timestamp proved it was taken at noon under a cloudless sky. It became clear that Olsen's legacy wasn't confined to history. His betrayal had seeded something self-perpetuating, an infection of time, memory, and land. Survivors of modern encounters often reported hearing commands in their sleep, always the same: "Stay close, trust me," words once spoken in 1889, repeating through generations like a curse. Territorial archives, long sealed, were reopened briefly in 2014. Within them lay fragments of testimony never intended for public eyes. One deputy described hearing children's laughter echoing through the canyon during the initial search. though no bodies were ever found. Another swore he saw Olsen's boot prints in fresh snow hours after the man was already locked in a cell awaiting questioning. The judge's notes, buried beneath more official documents, revealed a chilling conclusion: what cannot prosecute what does not die. Olsen's guilt extends beyond mortal law. His crime is not murder alone, but an arrangement with forces that demand renewal. Those lines were struck from the record, yet the ink still bleeds through the page like a wound that refuses to close. And now, you listening, think carefully. Each retelling awakens the trail. Each ear that absorbs his name reopens the path. If you haven't already, subscribe, because stories like this aren't just history. They're warnings. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from. Because if Olsen's reach spreads across distance, then the ground beneath your feet may already carry his shadow. The deeper investigators probed, the more the evidence shifted from the physical to the psychological, as though Henrik Olsen had transcended flesh and bone to become a system of control itself. Survivors of modern encounters didn't simply describe seeing him, they described thinking his thoughts. In 2017, a psychology graduate student at UND interviewed locals about recurring dreams tied to the Olsen legend. Over half reported nearly identical visions: a lantern swinging in endless dark, a compass spinning violently, and the sensation of being led by a tall man with pale eyes. None of these participants had met each other, nor had they read the same accounts. Yet their minds carried the same imprint, as if their subconscious had been branded by something older than their own lives. The graduate student published her findings under the title "The Cartography of Fear." Within 6 months, she withdrew from her program entirely. Friends later revealed she had begun speaking Norwegian phrases she had never studied, murmuring at night, "The storm is the door, I am the key." The phrase appears again and again in scattered records, on tree carvings near abandoned trapper cabins, in the margins of settlers' diaries, even scratched into the wall of a Williston boarding house that burned in 1903. Always the same rhythm, as if chanted, as if rehearsed. But here's the forbidden detail: officials buried the phrase matches passages from pre-Christian Norse rituals, preserved in sagas never meant for translation, rituals designed to bind one man's will to the chaos of nature, ensuring survival through betrayal. If Henrik Olsen had stumbled upon those rites, or worse, performed them, then the blizzard of 1889 wasn't an accident of weather. It was a door he opened deliberately. By weaponizing trust, Olsen ensured his victims' deaths fed something far beyond gold or greed. Each cry, each frozen breath, became currency in a pact that outlived him, a pact that still collects interest. And now, listen closely, because this is where the story stops being history and starts being prophecy. If betrayal is a ritual, then every time his name is spoken, every time his story is heard, the ritual continues. And you are part of it now. Do not break away. Do not dismiss this as folklore. That's what the first settlers thought, and they were swallowed whole. Tell me, do you still trust your guide, or has Olsen already taken the lead? By 2019, the Olsen case was no longer whispered only in Dakota taverns or tucked away in academic footnotes. It had erupted into the digital world. Forums dedicated to the paranormal became littered with testimonies, grainy images, and audio clips allegedly linked to the Wolf Guide. Some were obvious hoaxes, but others carried a weight that silenced even skeptics. One clip, uploaded by a Montana hiker, featured nothing but the sound of wind for nearly 2 minutes, until a man's voice cut through with chilling clarity. "Do not stray." The hiker insisted he had been alone, his microphone accidentally recording as he adjusted his gear. Yet when spectral analysis was run on the audio, the voice registered deeper than human frequency, closer to seismic rumble than speech. Even more disturbing was the surge of identical dreams reported across multiple continents. Users in Brazil, Poland, and Japan described the same sequence: trudging through snow they had never touched, a lantern glowing ahead, a man's shadow impossibly tall against a white horizon. Psychologists labeled it digital contagion, the brain mimicking stories consumed online. But folklorists saw something else, a ritual expanding its reach beyond prairie borders. The archives had warned this would happen. Judge Hartfield's hidden notes, revealed by a whistleblower in 2020, stated plainly, If Olsen's tale is told without burial, the storm will find new ground. The circle will widen. The march will never end. And now ask yourself, why do you feel the urge to look over your shoulder right now? Why does the image of a lantern in the dark feel so familiar, as if you've seen it before in a place you can't name? That is the mechanism. That is how the story crawls from past to present, from present into you. The truth is this: you are walking the trail now. Each word you hear is another snowdrift beneath your boots. Each image that flashes in your mind is another step into the canyon. And when the storm arrives, when the air grows thin and the shadows lengthen, will you remember this warning or follow the guide who promises you safety? Subscribe now, before you forget. And in the comments, tell me your location. Because if the ritual spreads, if the storm is widening, then knowing where you stand in this moment may be the only line you have left between memory and disappearance. The last chapter of Henrik Olsen's story isn't really an ending, because endings imply closure, and closure is something this tale will never allow. The prairie still remembers. Every storm that tears across Dakota carries with it the sound of boots crunching in snow, the flicker of a lantern in the white void, the echo of words whispered in your own language, but with an accent you shouldn't recognize. Stay close. Trust me? Scholars now debate whether Olsen was a murderer, a prophet of survival gone mad, or the vessel of something far older than the frontier itself. But for those who live nearest to Dead Wagon Gulch, the argument doesn't matter. They know the truth. They lock their doors when the sky turns white. They draw their curtains when the wind howls. And above all, they never speak his name aloud when the snow begins to fall, because the legend has rules, and every rule broken feeds the pact. Every time his name is spoken, every time his story is told, the ritual reignites. Maybe you think this is just history dressed in superstition. Maybe you'll laugh it off when you close this video, but when you hear a knock at your door in the middle of a storm, steady, deliberate, as if from a man holding a lantern, you'll remember, and you'll have to decide whether or not to open. Henrik Olsen's case is not over. It cannot be over. Because the storm was never just weather. It was always a door, and somewhere out there, still waiting, still guiding, still betraying, the Wolf Guide walks. If you've made it this far, type, "The storm is the door," in the comments so I know you're one of the few who reached the end. And remember, subscribe, because this isn't the last time we'll drag a buried story out from the snow. Now tell me, would you follow him, even after the supposed ending of Henrik Olsen's tale? Researchers, skeptics, and believers alike continue to circle his story, because it refuses to die. Historians argue that the gulch should have faded into obscurity like any other frontier tragedy. Yet instead, it has only grown louder. Unlike most ghost stories, which shrink as generations pass, Olsen's legend has expanded. The further time pulls us away from 1889, the closer his presence seems to come. Some point to collective trauma. The settlers of Dakota carried with them old-world fears of betrayal, hunger, and endless winter. Those anxieties condensed into Olsen, a figure who embodied every nightmare, the trusted man who leads you into death. Psychologists claim the story resurfaces because it reflects our deepest human dread, that salvation is a lie, that the one you depend on most will turn against you. But there are others who believe the evidence speaks for itself. The compass found spinning in 2002. The coins marked with symbols older than America, the repeated dreams across continents. Patterns that suggest something more than folklore, a continuing ritual. And the digital age has only strengthened it. What began as whispers around prairie fires is now a global chant. Every retelling online multiplies its reach. Every person who reads his name, every ear that hears his story, feeds the current. It doesn't matter if you believe it. The ritual does not require belief, only attention. Folklorists have begun calling it a living mythos, like the urban legends of Slender Man or the cursed phone numbers of Japan. Olsen thrives not on proof, but on repetition. But unlike invented legends, his roots are anchored in history, an actual storm, an actual betrayal, an actual man who once lived and vanished. That kernel of truth makes the infection far harder to kill. So here we are, more than a century later, still telling his tale. And in doing so, perhaps we are all stepping into that storm, lantern swinging, compass spinning, voices guiding us where we should never go, because the question is no longer did Henrik Olsen betray his men. The question is how many more will he betray even now? And if you hear the knock, if you see the glow through the white curtain of snow, remember the storm is the door. The Wolf Guide waits. If you've listened this far, then you've already stepped onto the trail. That isn't superstition. It's how this story works. The settlers believed they were safe until the storm closed in around them. You believe you're safe now, listening from your room, your phone glowing in your hand, but the ritual does not care where you sit. It only cares that you've heard. Every retelling is an invitation. Every ear that absorbs the words is another lantern in the snow. Right now, yours is burning. Right now, you are walking. So when the storm comes, whether tomorrow or years from now, you'll know it by the sudden silence in your house, the flicker of light in the corner of your eye, the sound of boots crunching outside though no one should be there, and then the knock, always 3 times slow. Certain. When it comes, you'll have a choice. Do not answer and risk freezing in place forever, or open the door and trust the guide who promises you safety. But remember, this trust is the weapon. The storm is the door, and Henrik Olsen always waits. If you've heard the knock before, type, "I followed the lantern," in the comments. Only the brave will admit it. And subscribe, because stories like this don't just tell themselves. They find you.